Now, I Communicate continues on Full Service Radio, 830 WCRN. Once again, here's your host, Mark Altman.
All right, we're back. Welcome back to the show, and hope you're having a stress-free day at work, and you're managing your coworker and client relationships and demonstrating emotional intelligence every chance you get. So, I want to talk about the final aspect of managing these client relationships, and what it is influencing experiences. And what's interesting about that, the word that comes to mind when I teach this is neutralization. And what I mean by that is, how do you neutralize toxic behavior? How do you neutralize concerns? How do you assuage people's fears? So when these obstacles and issues come up, and they always do, what happens in many cases is you feel insecure, it's a setback, and it could really dominate your thought process at that point. So part of really influencing those experiences is proactively anticipating what's going to come up and when. And one of the tricky things about closing in sales is a lot of organizations, if they have a training manual or some kind of sales training, you'll see in the handbook, it'll be like a step-by-step process. First, we build rapport. Then we overcome objections. Then we close. And there's all these steps laid out by that. And I always chuckle when I see that, because building rapport is not the first step. You're supposed to be always doing it. Closing, you should always be closing throughout by asking questions and giving impactful responses. So it's a list of, here's all the things that make up a client relationship, not necessarily in a specific order or step. Sometimes people, because of time requirements or expectations, you might not have time to build rapport in the beginning. What I see a lot of salespeople do is, if they don't have an opportunity to build rapport in the beginning because they'll feel rushed, then build rapport later in the call. But you still got to do it. So I think when it comes to closing, there should be no final stage of closing. By the time you get to the end of the sales process, you should have made sure you covered everything you need. Because one of the best compliments you could get managing a relationship with a salesperson is that the prospect comes back to you and says, geez, I have no more questions. You've answered everything else you need. Then you closed. But if they come back to you 3 days later or a week later and say, oh, well, I didn't think of this or whatever, then in many cases, you didn't do your job. Because now they thought of additional reasons why they wouldn't do the deal or they might not do the deal. So the closing, the rapport building, the asking questions, the active listening should happen all throughout. They're not individual stages. So the second aspect to emotional intelligence in sales is self-awareness. And what's interesting about this is sometimes we misjudge how our actions affect others. So becoming more aware of the things we say and lessening the times we act out of impulse can really help your sense of self-awareness. Now, one of the great habits salespeople can do is every time you finish an appointment, for those of us who have a CRM, we're putting our notes in the CRM, the key things we heard in the appointment. But are you self-aware of the things that you said or say frequently that resonate most with the client or with the prospect? Are you seeing big head nods? Are you hearing things like, wow, that's exactly what we needed? Are you hearing things like, we've never heard that before, no one's ever shared that information before? Those are the kind of things you should be listening for to know how you are influencing experiences, people, and situations. And what's interesting is that from a self-awareness perspective, when a deal doesn't come through, most salespeople don't take the time to find out why it didn't come through. They'll just assume, oh, it was money. I love when salespeople rely on that excuse and they say, oh, it was just money. They didn't have the budget. Well, yeah, that's true a very small percentage of the time. But in many cases, we truly don't understand. And that would require a phone call. And before our listeners say, well, they don't always answer the phone, they don't always respond, which is true, make a call and say, listen, I really appreciate your time invested. I would love your feedback on why you didn't eventually go with our product. But you know what gets in the way of that phone call? is rejection. And so when we get rejected by people, the tendency is to email the people because we don't want to hear their voice. It's like looking at someone in the eye. We don't want to look at them in the eye. We don't want to hear their voice. We just want to hide behind an email and hope they respond to it. But when you personally take the time to get the self-awareness of why that deal doesn't go through, that's a core value of learning this. That's emotional intelligence. Now, what's interesting, the other point on this, which, I mean, maybe one or two organizations I've come across in the 5 years I've done this is it goes both ways. You also want to know why people decided to go with you. Most salespeople are so excited when they get a deal, and rightfully so. But why did you get the deal? Yes, we know your product or service must have fit their needs. Yes, that's a given. But what was it you said? What was the big selling point or step along the way that really clinched it? You need to know that also. You just don't need to know the negatives. You need to know the positives because that will reinforce behaviors for you. And those reinforced behaviors will lead to more outcomes for you. So when it comes to self-awareness, those are big pieces. Now, here are the 3 questions when I'm trying to ascertain whether a salesperson is very good at emotional intelligence. These are the 3 things I think about. First, what emotionally triggers you? Is it body language? You know what I hear a lot emotionally triggers salespeople these days? When people are on their phone, when your prospect is on the phone while you're meeting with them. And that would trigger me to, like, I think most people, if you're sharing important information and the person's not paying attention, then yeah, that would frustrate me. That would annoy me. But it's not that you have to apologize for that for frustrating you. You have to be aware of how you respond to those situations. So it's either a prospect not listening. It's something a prospect says that is something they've heard before that rubs them the wrong way. Those are probably the 2 most common examples. So if you say, I'm an emotionally intelligent salesperson, the first question I'm going to ask you is, well, what are the things that upset you and how do you respond to those things when they happen? And let's face it, everybody, first impressions communication, if you show frustration, if you show disappointment, if you show a lack of confidence, that in itself, you could have the best service and product in the world, but that could interfere with that. The second thing is how to pinpoint and deal with your own weaknesses, okay? So we have an assessment we send to companies that allows leadership and sales team members to try to identify where their weaknesses are. But you know what? How do you know where your weaknesses are? You know, a lot of leadership team will say, well, they're bad at closing. Well, okay, but what part of closing are they bad at? You know, what part of overcoming objections are they bad at? Are they not asking the right questions? Are they not listening to understand? Are they not as familiar with the product or services they need to be? Do they not have a process that's proven and it works? It could be any of those things. But when we deal with weaknesses at a high level and when we expect people to be self-aware of their own weaknesses, most often they're not. And one of the leadership points I train on is a concept called heavy lifting. And heavy lifting is when you're putting people on the spot and asking them to be self-aware and critically think, especially about weaknesses or areas of improvement. We have to give them suggestions because most of the time people on their own can't pull these things up in their head. And the last part of the second phase of sales emotional intelligence is how your communication can impact another person. Now, I'd like to think I'm really good at what I do. And you know something? I need to have that confidence. You know, we do evaluations after every training, after every speaking engagement. 99% of the time, they're great. So good. Yeah, I feel good about the work we do and how we help people. But at the end of the day, how does your communication impact another person? I find that when I'm in workshops a lot, I give people a lot of compliments, only when they're justified, authentic and when they're justified. And I look at people's faces when I give them compliments a lot of time, and I feel like, man, I bet these people haven't gotten a compliment in years. Whether it's from their boss, whether it's from their spouse, whether it was from their parents, people are not used to getting positive feedback and compliments. They're used to hearing what they're bad at or what they need to improve on. So how does your communication impact another person? Your word choice and your tone and your body language, every time you interact with someone, it impacts that other person. And I'm not trying to make it heavy. The reality is it is. And so are you mindful of the way you're communicating? And it can be really simple things. Are you speaking too fast? Are you speaking too softly? If you're trying to get people engaged and interested in what you have to say, they sure as heck, it's hard enough to pay attention, never mind if you're speaking too fast or too softly. It can be as simple as things like that. So to recap, when we talk about self-awareness, we're talking about what triggers you, how do you respond, how do you deal with the weaknesses that you have, and more importantly, have you accurately identified the areas of improvement you have? And then are you mindful and self-aware of how your communication impacts everybody you deal with? Coworkers, other decision makers, leaders, team members. Now, a self-aware salesperson can consciously identify these feelings, recognize them and deal with them, and not let them fester internally to drive your inner voice crazy. So when we come back for our third segment, we're going to talk about the third component of emotional intelligence in sales, which is that nasty inner voice I just spoke of, self-management. I'm Mark Altman. This is the Mindset Go radio show. We'll be back after the break.